Hello, welcome to my videos about Walter Scott Waverley. I tend to use this channel as a sort of book club, just to help me get my head around what I think of books. I experimented with Waverley. I started doing these chapters as I read the books, and I did put them up on YouTube. Now I'm redoing them because having got much closer to the end, and I think I'll do this in future, it works very well. It works better for me. I have more ideas. I have better ideas about these early chapters. So what I'm doing, I'm now redoing those videos. I will take them off YouTube as I put the new ones up. The new ones hopefully will be punchier, more precise. I kind of followed Walter Scott's, where I thought he was going. Now I actually know where he was going. So I can see what in those early chapters were plot lines that just trailed away into nothing and what followed through. Now, the way I'm doing this is chapter by chapter. At the end, I'll make a special video that's just really short and just a review of the actual whole book. This is just for anybody who might be bored enough while they're reading Waverley to just see what somebody else thinks of it chapter by chapter. As I did these videos before, and I will stop mentioning that because they'll be gone, so they'll be irrelevant, but as I did them, I started finding images to help flesh out the characters, because Walter Scott he's got some fairly good descriptions of scenery, but he's not very good at describing his people. I'm sure he could see them, but and that wasn't expected in those days. People didn't need that, perhaps. But a modern reader certainly likes to know what people look like. It helps cement that character into your head. It helps you visualise the people. So when I did this, because it does help me as well, I used Wikimedia, which has public domain pictures. Because Walter Scott's Waverley was set, he wrote it in somewhere around 1814, I think he started it. There are a lot of pictures, a lot of portraits on Wikimedia and other places of people of that time period, wearing the right clothes with the right kind of presentation. And because Walter Scott's characters tended to be aristocracy or bordering on aristocracy, the people in those portraits are exactly the people he's writing about. I thought I'd explain that here because those artists were not painting the characters of Waverley. A lot of these paintings have just been found in old houses or handed down to people or sold for whatever reason, perhaps sold and had the frames removed. We don't know who they are, a lot of them. So they're just sort of random portraits of, a gentleman in a study or a girl sitting in a meadow. That's all we know. We don't know who those people were. It's not legally required to say who painted them. I like to put that in, so I will generally have that on the first time I show the picture. At least I'll have the artist's name. If we know who it was, I'll mention that. But I'd like to explain that here, that I am just picking those images just because it fleshes out a character to have some idea of how they might have looked, how they might have dressed. And from then on, I'll have somewhere on it, I'll just have the painter's name in small print somewhere on the screen. Anyway, I just wanted to explain that so that it was clear. That's where I'm getting them from. They're public domain images on Wikimedia that just match the characters as best I can tell. I've also found some pictures of the scenery, the actual places that Walter Scott wrote about. I've put them into where I can, just to make it a bit more visual. That's probably all I need to say about that. At times, if I feel that I cannot improve on the way I explained something before, I will put in a little bit of footage from those earlier videos. Hopefully that's not too confusing. I've changed a bit in how I look. I recorded them a couple of years ago. I was dealing with some health problems back then, and I'm not now. Hopefully that won't make any difference. And so, to begin, I'd actually decided to read The Antiquarian. I chose that one because it was Walter Scott's favourite, apparently. But when I went to have a look at that, it turned out it was part of a group of 3 books. It was the third in the series that he wrote. And when I say series, I mean that sort of loosely. It was the third in a sort of overall theme. The first book he wrote was Waverley, Waverley was set 60 years in the past, in his past. So his present day being, at the time he wrote this, 1814 to 1820, this was set 60 years earlier. So Waverley was set in what Walter Scott called the Age of Our Fathers. That was followed by Guy Mannering, which was set in the years of his own youth. It was then followed by The Antiquarian, which was set in his current time period, being his older years, as he called them, but he wasn't actually very old. By our standards, he wasn't actually very old at the time. So when I realised that, I thought, I can't read The Antiquarian until I've read the earlier ones, and that's what brought me back to Waverley. And whether I ever actually get onto The Antiquarian, it might happen, but these books are rather dense. After finishing Waverley, to be honest, I sort of feel satisfied with that for a while. But eventually I will go on and read the rest. Now, the Waverley novels are basically all of his books. He actually began writing this, I think it was around 1814, perhaps a little earlier. He put it out there and people didn't like it. It didn't get a very good response. So he gave up on it for a while. He went on and he did some poems. His poetry was very well received. After that, after he'd achieved a bit of success with that, he went back to his manuscript and presumably rewrote sections. I feel that in reading this, I can pick up the point that he came back to it and was a bit more confident, a bit more experienced. But I'll talk about that as I get to those chapters. Now, just an overview, he did write a whole lot of books. They are called the Waverley novels. They're not really a set. These days, if we had something like the Waverley novels, they would probably all be in the same universe. They would be maybe even the same characters. To some extent, that does hold for these. A lot of them have the same characters, but only in that they're set in the same time period. They're set in Scotland. When he did these first ones, they were hugely successful and he sort of capitalised on the theme. So some of the later ones have, for instance, this book has Bonnie Prince Charlie in it. And he is a recurring character. He turns up later on, but he's never the protagonist. He's just a figure in the distance and it's events around him that the story is about. So to that extent, there is a sort of unifying cast, but it's not the main people. You don't follow the main people on from book to book to book. Now, my copies of the Waverley novels are this series, and I will hold that up. I bought them very cheap years ago. They have water damage. They were obviously sitting in a shed taking in some damp and damage. I wasn't rich at the time. I was lucky to get them. I really appreciate the fact that I've got them. I have a nearly complete set of these. We are missing one volume and I have never found it. I am still looking for it. Every so often you see this edition coming up on eBay, but nobody's had Rob Roy yet. One person had it, one shop, and when I tried to buy it, they wouldn't sell it to me. I think that probably they had the whole set and they didn't want to split it, which is fair enough. But if you're going to do that, then put that in your ad. You know, don't advertise a single book. If you're going to advertise a single book, just put somewhere in there that it's part of a set and you're selling the set, because they had to refund my money. And anyway, and it's still out there. The ad is still there for it, but I know now that it's not a book for sale. Anyway, that's just a little side rant, because if I could get hold of the copy of Rob Roy, one from this edition, I would have the complete set, which would be lovely. In the meantime, I have a different version of Rob Roy. So these are the Centenary edition. They were printed in 1871, which was 100 years after Walter Scott was born. They have a nice picture of him. Here is the man. You can see all the spots of damage in this book. They've had a fairly quiet life since I got hold of them, and I've had them for 25 years, I think. But, you know, damage was done. And obviously, like they will still deteriorate. It's strange. When I bought them, there was a lot of stuff around from the 1870s. It wasn't really deemed to be all that old. Kind of like stuff from the 1950s, 1960s is now. I mean, that makes me sound a lot older than I am, but in the place that I lived, there wasn't many new books coming out, and these things were everywhere in like the op shops, which you could buy them for 20 cents. Nowadays, we think of 1871 books as antiques. So I'll just show you my set, which are, I'll put this down. My set of Waverley novels are, if I can take this over, in this bookcase. So here they are. If I have to open both doors here, they are these books. I'm pretty sure I've got them. And as you can see, some of them are not in very good condition. Some of them are not so bad. And these are currently not in order because I actually shifted them over from a different bookcase and I haven't set them in the proper place. But the only one missing is Rob Roy. One day I will get that. So, the picture at the start of this book of Walter Scott has always reminded me of Bilbo Baggins. Now this is something else I'm going to mention probably quite a lot through this because I feel as if Tolkien read this book. There's a lot of things in The Lord of the Rings that... There's a scene in Waverley and it reminds me really strongly of The Lord of the Rings. I'll point them out as I go through because they really struck me. And it's probably utterly coincidental, but looking at that picture of Walter Scott at the start, sitting there with his dog and his walking stick, that image of Walter Scott has always reminded me of Bilbo Baggins. This is just it, isn't it? The storyteller, the older man, the creative thinker. And then moving on from that, we've got the first page with all of its water damage. The novel is actually called Waverley or 'Tis 60 Years Since. Walter Scott says in the beginning, somewhere here in one of the introductions, that as he was writing it, it started off being 50 years since, and then because it took a while in the writing, it became 60 years since. And I think at some point he actually turned it into 70 years since by the time it was published. But that's what he's talking about. From the time that he was writing the present day, the events of this story were happening 60 years earlier. When he wrote this book, Waverley, has often been considered the very first historical novel. It's not quite true. It is and it isn't. Other people did write books that were set in the past. And one that's referenced quite often is Maria Edgeworth's Castle Rackrent. The difference for this one is that he tried to be as historically accurate as he could, and in some ways it's a history lesson because he did aim for accuracy. It's not just like a romantic story that happens to be set in a certain time period. The events that happen in this book are absolutely tied to that time period, and he has famous characters that appear in the book doing the thing that they really did at that time in that place. So that's what makes it a historical novel. Because it was the first historical novel, readers didn't know what to expect. They didn't have fictional books the way we do. There were very few of them out there. It was a time when nobody really knew what to do with fiction. In the past, fiction had sort of been tied in with allegory and like classical teachings. Like you got all the stories of the mythological tales, all the stories of deities, and there was a didactic element to them. Whereas fiction was just starting to develop with people just sort of writing out little fanciful stories. That was a fairly new thing. And at this point, nobody ever dreamed that you would be able to publish a book that was purely fiction if it didn't have some other kind of a point to it. So usually a fiction book was a teaching book of some sort. It was often religious. The author had a lesson to teach. He had some morals that he wanted to exemplify in his work, or yeah, something like that. So very often at this era you had things like the fair maiden who followed her own heart rather than listen to her parents, and died a miserable spinster because of it. It was that sort of thing. Publishers often just wouldn't publish a book that didn't have that, because they didn't think anyone would read it if it was just purely fiction. Like, why would you waste your time on something that was just a story? It wasn't a leisure activity that anybody knew about in those days. So when Walter Scott wrote this, he clearly didn't want to write some kind of teaching story. He wanted to write something that interested him, and because you still couldn't just write a fanciful story for the sake of the story, that didn't really exist. That's why I think he picked on history. It's historical. It is still teaching us. It is teaching us about the history of a time period, and people might read it in order to learn about those historical events. He has a lot of introductions because he had to kind of sell this book to people. He also had to, I'll talk about this more as we go through, he also had to tell people what it wasn't, so that people didn't pick it up for the wrong reasons. People didn't have false expectations. These days we do that with genre. You know that romance is going to have like a couple in love, and they will be kept apart for some reason, and they will come together at the end. If they don't come together at the end, it is not actually a romance. So you know what to expect. That didn't exist when he wrote this. So it's hard to really say what this book is. And on that note, I will just begin with, what have I said about it? It's a political novel, and that was an important part of history. I guess that's the next point. History also wasn't what we have today. History was very much tied with the history of great men. The idea was ordinary people lived ordinary lives. Extraordinary people did extraordinary things. You were born extraordinary, or you were born ordinary. An extraordinary event, you would look for the extraordinary person, because there had to be an extraordinary person. What Scott has done here, he's kind of got that. There will be the extraordinary people popping up, but not to the extent that you see it in history. It's all about politics, kind of because politics did drive everything that happened, which means that early on you kind of need to learn about the politics of the time, but not in great detail. You only need a really superficial understanding of it. So, Waverley, first published 1814, at which point it was 70 years ahead. It is set in 1745. So by 1814, that was about 70 years later, which is late enough that hardly anybody alive today would remember, like today being 1814, but everybody would have heard about it from their parents. So if you think back, what's 70 years ago for today? 1950. I mean, do we know anybody who remembers 1950? We might know people who were born in the 1940s, perhaps, but most of them would have just been little kids in the 1950s. And you will, of course, find people who are, 90 years old who remember the 50s quite well, but there's not so many of them around yet. The memories of that time are starting to die away. It's what they call living memory. It's still in living memory, but not so much as it was, which means that it had to be accurate, because there are plenty of people out there who might read this book who lived there, who were in the time, in the event he's talking about, who might then write to him or his publisher, or write to the local paper and say, this is a load of codswallop. That's not how it happened at all. He worked very hard to make it accurate. It opens with advertisement to edition 1829, which I don't know why this is at the beginning, because you'd think they'd start with like the earliest or the latest, but it's not. Anyway, 1829 was a big edition, and he just basically talks about how everybody now knows that he wrote it, and so he's tidied it up, because when he first wrote it, it was anonymous and nobody knew who it was, and there was a lot of speculation about who the author was. But by now, everybody knows that Walter Scott is the author. So he thought, since everybody knows it's him, he better go through and fix it all up and make it better. And then he says, well, you'll probably still find errors. I tried, but it's a big job. And he has this sentence that I really like. There is no doubt ample room for emendation in all these points that he's just listed, dialogue, etc., etc. But where the tree falls, it must lie. And I just really like that. That reminds me of The Lord of the Rings. You can imagine that coming up in there, couldn't you? Where the tree falls, it must lie. It just fits in that world. That's really all I want to say about that first couple of pages. The author also proposes to publish on this occasion the various legends, family traditions, or obscure historical facts which have formed the groundwork of these novels. So then we get on to Preface to the Third Edition. October 1814. So we've gone back in time to when it's the third edition, but I think they did like an edition every 6 months or something like that. It was a runaway success, this book. In this, people still don't know who it is. He's talking about how there's a lot of speculation, and he's going to let that speculation stay. For the present at least, it must remain uncertain whether Waverley be the work of a poet or a critic, a lawyer or a clergyman, or whether the writer, to use Mrs. Malaprop's phrase, be, like Cerberus, 3 gentlemen at once. Just a quick sentence or two to finish up, because it ended very abruptly. My camera ran out of battery when I recorded that one. This is what I'm doing in these videos. I'm just talking about them. I'm reading a chapter or a section, and then I'm saying what I thought of it. I don't know anybody who has read Waverley. It's a sort of a niche book. I don't like to say it's not a good example of writing of its time, because it is. It actually has a whole lot in it, but it's a bit clumsier than later books. It's even a bit clumsier than Walter Scott's later books. He learned with this book, like people do with their first book. He made his mistakes and he developed as it went on, and of course, in these days, he was writing it on pieces of paper by hand, and it's a big job to sort of rewrite a story. And it's quite serviceable once you plug through the beginning bits that are somewhat ponderous. And with that, I will leave this video and go on to the other pre-reading stuff that I think belongs in a series like this.